As we start Daniel chapter 4 today, 3 chapters have already been studied. The first chapter, Daniel is just a young man. He's been pulled out of the southern kingdom by Nebuchadnezzar and his men and taken over to Babylon along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And there the king decides to take care of them in every form and fashion, to feed them meat from his own table, wine from his own table. And Daniel says, oh, can we do this differently? Can we eat vegetables? And of course, the captain of his group that's training him says, oh, I don't want to do this. I might even lose my head if I let you do this. He would kill me. And finally, sure enough, Daniel is the cream of the crop, along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they rise to the top. And Arioch, the commander over him, is impressed with him, and sure enough, they end up looking better than all the rest of the men who are under the care. In the next chapter, chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he doesn't want to tell that dream to anybody, but he wants to know the interpretation. So he pulls in all the Chaldeans, the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and he asks for them to tell him what his dream is, and they can't tell him what his dream is. And finally he says, and he commands that all the wise men to be killed, and the word gets to Daniel, and Daniel says, whoa, wait a minute. Why is he in such a hurry? Let me go before the king, and I will ask the king if I can have some time. So in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel goes before Nebuchadnezzar. He asks for time. Nebuchadnezzar gives him time. He comes back and not only tells him the dream, but he also tells him the interpretation. And in that dream, chapter 1 is totally fulfilled. Chapter 2 is almost all fulfilled because Daniel tells him about that image that Nebuchadnezzar had seen of a head of gold, a breast and arms of silver, a chest, a bottom area of bronze, waist and thigh of iron, and 10 toes made of iron and clay. The head was Nebuchadnezzar. The arms were the Medo-Persian Empire. The bottom area here was the bronze, was the Greek Empire. The waist and legs of iron was the Roman Empire, and the 10 toes, was the 10 countries that were made up from the fallen Roman Empire. 10 toes. Great Britain, or just Britain at that point in time, France, Spain, Italy, and North Africa, Algeria as we know it right now. The other toes were Macedonia, Greece, Turkey, Syria, and Egypt. 10 toes. The only thing in chapter 2 that is not fulfilled is those 10 toes joining back as one nation, even in our future. That's all that's left to be fulfilled in chapter 2, is for those 10 toes to join back together. Chapter 3 comes along last week as we were studying it. Nebuchadnezzar has ended all of his conquering of all the land. He controls all the land all the way over to the Indus River, which is just before you go over a mountain range to go into India. It's the same place that later on, many years later, 200 years after this, almost 300 years after this, that Alexander the Great will attempt to go over, and his men will say, we're just tired. We don't want to go over there. We're tired of fighting. And so Alexander the Great will stop there, but he will own everything. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar owns everything all the way back just about to Britain and all the way down around the North African coast. Everything's under Nebuchadnezzar's domain. He's fought every people and person that he has seen, the Lord has given that person under Nebuchadnezzar's domain. Every bird, every tree, every piece of land is under his domain, and Nebuchadnezzar has ceased from his warring efforts, and he's come home, and he has built an image of gold, and he's commanded all of his officers, all of his government officials to come and dedicate that. He didn't bring in the people of Babylon. He brought in just those who worked for him as officials. And of course, we know what happened there is a fiasco. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decide not to bow because they're not going to bow before any image. They would not bend and they would not bow. So Nebuchadnezzar says, you're going to burn. Throw them into that fiery furnace that's been heated 7 times of what it normally is. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar draws near after his valiant soldiers have died, putting Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into that fiery furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar draws near and he says, lo, didn't we throw 3 in? I see 4. Come out of there, boys. Come on out of there. And in both cases, with Daniel and the the statue, and with Shadrach, Meshach, and the image of gold, Nebuchadnezzar comes to a point in his life where he says, your God must be the best God. Your God must be the highest God. Your God is the God above all other gods. But he says that because that's just what he has understood, but yet he has not come to a point in his life where he's realized that none of the so-called gods that they worship are any gods at all. They've made them with their own hands. They've carved them out of wood. They've covered them with either gold or silver, and then they've set them up on a mantle somewhere or up on a pedestal, and then they've bowed down to the things that they have created with their own hands. There's nothing new about that because we do that today. We do it all the time. Look at the business that I have built. Look at the house that I have built. Look at this that I have built. Look at this that I created. Look at these paintings that I painted. Look at this that I did. Look at this that I did. Look at the kids that I have raised. Look at the kids that I have educated. Look at this. Look at this. Look at this. It's all in a case where we are always looking for our glory and not God's glory, and yet it's very clear in the past 3 chapters that everything that Nebuchadnezzar has been given to him by God and by no one else. By no one else. Well, as we pick up in chapter 4, it's our last visit to Nebuchadnezzar. We will not see Nebuchadnezzar again in the book of Daniel. This is our last time with him. It's sometime after 585 BC. We don't know exactly when. Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream. As we open up the very first verse of this, Nebuchadnezzar has already gone through everything that is in this chapter. It has already been fulfilled. There is nothing, as we start verse 1 in this chapter, that is not already fulfilled. Chapter 1's fulfilled. Chapter 2 is almost all fulfilled. Chapter 3 is fulfilled. Chapter 4 is fulfilled. There's nothing in the future, not in our future, that we're waiting for. Only in chapter 2 are we waiting for those 10 countries to join back together. So those of y'all who are trying to see some deeper meaning in chapter 4 or chapter 3 or chapter 1 that's about in the future, just mark it off your list because they're all fulfilled. Just completely fulfilled. As is in the case with Isaiah and most of the chapters in Isaiah, and about half the chapters in Zechariah and most of the chapters in Hosea, they're all fulfilled. They're fulfilled. And we went through the Bible story. I showed you where every one of those things was fulfilled. It came through in your notes. This is fulfilled. This is when it happened. This is when it happened. This is when it happened. To go back and to grab a passage from there and try to make it something for the future or even for the day is just wrong. It's false teaching. Here we are. It is after 585, Nebuchadnezzar showed back up his kingdom. He's going to have this dream about a tree. Now, this dream about a tree is going to take, I'm just going to tell you ahead of time, it's going to take 8 years to fulfill. Well, Nebuchadnezzar dies in 561. So we have to back up. We have to add 8 years. We have to back up to 569 because he dies in 561. Remember, the numbers go backwards in the BC. So we have to back up to 569. The latest that this story about Nebuchadnezzar could start would be 569. The earliest could be 585. It's a 16-year period. We don't know where it happens, but it happens somewhere in there. But one thing we do know, I do not believe it happens towards 569 because 8 years have to transpire, and in that 8 years, at the end of that 8 years, according to some of the last verses in this passage, it tells us that when Nebuchadnezzar is put back on his throne, after all this stuff happens to him, after 8 years, his kingdom becomes greater than it ever was before. Well, that doesn't happen just in a year. You follow me? That he has surpassing greatness, in fact, is what it says. So I think it probably happened somewhere back towards that 585 time after he's done the fiasco with the Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego and the fiery furnace. I think it happens pretty quick after that, in fact. So we pick up here in Daniel chapter 4, verse 1. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king to all the people, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth. He's telling this story to everybody that's under his control. And he really controls the entire known world. Now listen, there's an unknown world to him at this point in time too. You remember, he's not gone over into India. He's not crossed that mountain range. And that mountain range has already been crossed by the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Specifically, Ham's descendants. And then you go up towards the north area that he has not crossed over into the China area. And by this time in the story, the Orientals, the descendants of Shem, the relatives of Abraham, in fact, have already started populating China and Japan and Vietnam and all those countries now. And even some of them have crossed over what we would call the Bering Strait, come through Alaska, and come on down into the United States by this time, and on down to South America. By this time in the story of what's going on in the world, we already have the Aztec issues coming on, okay? So all this history and stuff. Nebuchadnezzar just controlled what he knew about on his side of the Himalaya mountains for all practical purposes. And yet, there's people all in the rest of the world, but here's the known world, the center of the world that is all belongs to Nebuchadnezzar, and he wants all of them, to every nation, every tongue that's underneath his control, to know what has happened to him in the past, and he wants them to know who the true God is. So he says, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. What's a sign? A sign is something that God does in order to point people to him. God gives a sign so that people will be pointed towards him. What are the wonders? When God does a wonder, he is driving people towards him, so that they can have a belief in him, but he never, with his wonders, ever forces someone to believe. He just drives them to that point. It's their choice to believe. He makes no one believe in him, but he puts them right there where they have no other choice but to believe in him or not to believe in him. And of course, that's the deciding factor. That's the deciding factor that either gets your name engraved in gold in the Lamb's Book of Life, or your name is blotted out of the Lamb's Book of Life based on that decision. Many of y'all have seen signs and wonders that God has done in your life, that absolutely no one else in the world could have done these wonders and signs except for God and the miracles that have happened. When he's done this, he says, how great are his signs and how mighty are the wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. Nebuchadnezzar knows that his kingdom is only going to last 1 or 2 or 3 more generations. But he also knows that God's kingdom, the kingdom that belongs to him, belongs to God, is a kingdom that will go on for generation after generation after generation. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar has already experienced everything in this chapter. Verse 4 says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. See, he's telling us, he rolls back time to tell us what happened, how this whole story, it's a flashback, how the whole story started. He said, I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, as I laid on my bed and the visions in my mind, kept alarming me. All of you have had this experience. If you're over 10 years old, you've had these experiences where you've just had the same dream all over and over and over and over. Have any of y'all ever dreamed over and over, night after night, that you've been losing your teeth? Your teeth have been falling out? Will anybody testify to that? Can anybody raise their hand? No, she won't. Oh, you can. Good. We got people just like you. Okay. We have people. Okay. How about this? That you're running and trying to run away, but you can't run fast. You're running and slow. Got you there. Oh, you did that too? Yeah, see, you're right up there with me. I dream my teeth are falling out. I've dreamed that. How many of you have dreamed that, I don't know how to say this, I'll say this nicely, that you showed up not dressed appropriately someplace? Oh, you too? Oh, no. At least you're being honest, yes. Yes, we see those hands. Nebuchadnezzar is having this reoccurring dream every night, over and over. Do any of y'all have something that you dream about over and over again? Sure you do. Absolutely. Over. He's having the same dream over and over, reoccurring over and over. He says, I saw a dream, and it made me fearful, and these fantasies as I laid on my bed and the visions in my mind, they kept alarming me. And finally, he can't stand it any longer. And in verse 6, he says, so I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Seems like 20 years later, he would have learned his lesson. Remember, he brought in all the wise men, and they were so wise they kind of did wisecracks at him over in the 2nd chapter of Daniel, and they could not answer him. He said, listen, if you can't tell me my dream, its interpretation, I'm going to have you torn limb from limb, and your houses will be reduced to a heap of rubbish. That was his standard operating procedure. We also saw it with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. that if you did not bend and you not bow, your bodies would be torn limb from limb and your houses would be destroyed into a heap of rubbish, is what he said. He said it in chapter 2 and chapter 3. Here, he just comes along. He says, I need the wise men. So he calls for all the wise men to come. Had Daniel not stopped Nebuchadnezzar from killing all the wise men, he wouldn't have this problem here in chapter 4, because they would not have existed in the kingdom. And yet Daniel stopped Nebuchadnezzar from slaying all the wise men by interpreting the dream in chapter 2. And that was 20 years before. He gave orders for them to show up. What happens with these guys? Then the magicians and the conjurers and the Chaldeans and the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. Well, do tell. I don't think they ever could have interpreted anything, because God had not given them the abilities as magicians and sorcerers, making horoscopes and conjurers and putting together cantations and everything for false gods that don't even exist anyway. They were unable. At least they were honest this time. Chapter 2, they weren't honest. Chapter 2, they were trying to drag things out and get a little bit of information so they could tell Nebuchadnezzar what he thought they thought he wanted to hear. Here, they can't relate the dream. That's pretty good. Verse 8. But finally, Daniel came in before me. See, he's first person. Nebuchadnezzar's telling this story. So whoever's writing this down is writing it down as if Nebuchadnezzar has written it down. And quite honestly, Nebuchadnezzar may have written this down, and it may have gone out in a letter to all the world, to his known world, because he's writing it as if he's telling it to all the kingdoms, because he wants them to know the goodness of the most holy God. So finally Daniel came into me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. Oh, that wasn't very good. And in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And I related the dream to him, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream, which I have seen, along with its interpretation. Tell me what it is, O Daniel. Tell me Daniel is trusted by Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel has every reason to be trusted by Nebuchadnezzar. For more than 20 years now, Daniel has taken care of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. While Nebuchadnezzar has been off warring and capturing everything, Daniel has been second in charge of everything. Everything. Which makes him head of the magicians, head of the Chaldeans, head of the sorcerers, head of the magistrates, head of the governors, head of the sheriffs, head of the judges. He's head of everything. He's been second in command just underneath Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar sees Daniel, and I love it. It says, finally, Daniel came in. Finally. Kind of like the margarine commercial we used to see. Da, 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 da. I imagine every time that every time Daniel entered into Nebuchadnezzar's presence, in Nebuchadnezzar's heart, it went da 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 da. You know that feeling. Have y'all got any of y'all got any automatic lights in your house? Where when you walk into the room, the light turns on? Doesn't that make you feel special? Don't you hear da 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 when you walk in? I will tell you this. And I'm going to embarrass my wife. Every time she walks into the room, my heart just leaps for joy. It really does. It really, really does. And I'm glad that happens, because love covers a multitude of sins. Did you know that? It really does. My wife is as pure as the driven snow and has never sinned in her life. And as long as I keep believing that, I'm going to be okay. And everything will be well. Men, I want to tell you something. You want to know how to have a happy marriage? If something's important to your wife, it needs to be important to you. In walks Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar goes, oh, Daniel, oh, Daniel. Nothing baffles you, for you have the spirit of a holy God inside of you. He knows that Daniel has a connection with the one who can answer all and knows all. Now, I don't ever do much with the visions, guys. You notice we're just going to read the vision. It's just what it is. So let's don't try to tear it apart too much. Let's just hear the vision. Nebuchadnezzar says this to Daniel. Now these were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. I was looking, behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. And the tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky. And it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruits abundant. And in it all was food for all. The beasts of the fields found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches. And all the living creatures fed themselves from it. I was looking in the visions in my mind, and as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted out and spoke as follows: chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its foliage, scatter its fruit. Let the beast flee from under it, and the birds from its branches, yet leave the stump with its root in the ground. Put with it a band of iron and bronze around it in the new grass of the fields. New grass, that's springtime. And let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beast in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man. Let a beast's mind be given to him. He's going to lose his human mind. He's going to be like an animal. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. That's 7 years, by the way. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind. In other words, that there's no other God over anything of mankind except the one true God. And that one God over rules over the realm of mankind, bestows it on whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men. Nebuchadnezzar is about to experience the lowest of the low. This is the dream which I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, you, Daniel, tell me its interpretation, inasmuch as none of the wise men in my kingdom is able to make known to me the interpretation. But you are able. Why are you able? Here's the answer. For a spirit of the holy gods is in you. Daniel has the full faith and trust of Nebuchadnezzar that he is in touch with God. Nebuchadnezzar, who is the greatest in the kingdom of the world at this point in time on earth, is about to find out what it's like to be on his hands and knees, the lowest of the low, like an animal crawling around. And God can bestow that on anyone he chooses. Anyone. It's very interesting. Just so everyone knows what I think. It's not always the leaders of an organization that make the organization work. Many times it's those whose names aren't even mentioned, who are actually making it tick and keeping it running. And we often think that those people are a dime a dozen and can be hired. But there are so often in every organization strategic people who, whenever they leave, there's a big gap and those holes are never filled. And that organization tends to crater after that, because those who are thought to be leaders are not the leaders. Those are the lowly ones. God has chosen to put them in a lowly position so that they are out of the line of fire, so that they can do the work to keep it running, so that the lowly ones who are in the highest position can get shot at by the emails and the complaints and the as our pastor said today, the murmuring. We've eaten quail until it's coming out our ears. Quail, the best meat on the face of the earth. That's really true. And I can't get some of my family to eat quail. That's a bird. We eat chicken. But it's not quail. Okay. Nebuchadnezzar trusts Daniel. Look here, verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, is appalled for a while as his thoughts alarm him. His thoughts alarm him. Appalled. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what's going on here? And the king responds and says to Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. I am sure that as Daniel is hearing Nebuchadnezzar tell him what his dream is, he has gone from a very pleasant face to a uh-oh. And yet the king who's telling the dream says, Daniel, don't worry about it. Just tell me the interpretation. Whatever it is, whatever you tell me, I will be okay with it. Don't let this bother you. Don't let this dream or interpretation alarm you. Just give me the facts. Just tell me what the truth is. And Daniel says, oh, my Lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversaries. Only if it applied to the Medes who are off to the east, or even the Persians who are fighting with the Medes at this point in time, who are both trying to rise up in authority and be bigger than you are, Nebuchadnezzar. If it was only for them, if it was only for the Assyrians that you have just captured and taken over control of them, if it was only the Egyptians who you have taken them over, if it was only those people over there in Rome who by this time in history has started and formed a political union at this point in time, it will take 500 years for Rome to form and be an empire, and it happens when General Julius is elected, puts together an alliance, and is finally elected to be Caesar in 44 BC. But the alliance starts in 60 BC. It's 500 years from now. Rome will finally take over. But we got to get past the Medo-Persians before that's going to happen. We got to get past the Greeks before that happens to finally get to the Romans. Lots of things have to happen. Only if this was against the southern kingdom that wants to rise up still against you with the few people we left over there, Daniel says, only if it was somebody that was your enemy, it would be easier. But this is not about your adversaries. Verse 20. Then the tree which you saw, which became large and grew strong, whose height reached to the skies and was visible to all the earth, and whose foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and whose branches the birds of the sky lodged. It is you, O king. This part of the prophecy is fulfilled right there. Fulfilled right there. It's you, O king. For you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. To every place they could get to, Nebuchadnezzar controlled. And his dominion was every place they could get to. The kingdom was Nebuchadnezzar's. Nebuchadnezzar, you're the tree. You are the tree. And in that, the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one, descending from the heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground. Put with it a band of iron and bronze around it in the new grass of the field in the springtime, and let him be drenched with the dew of the heaven, and let him share with the beasts of the field until 7 periods of time have passed over him. This is the interpretation, O king. And this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my Lord the King. You will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the fields. And you will be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whom he wishes. Listen, back in chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar saw the statue, and Daniel came in and not only told him the dream, the interpretation, but also the dream, Nebuchadnezzar comes back and says, your God must be the high God. But yet Nebuchadnezzar doesn't stop worshiping his own gods, his worldly gods at that point in time. Because this didn't have anything to do with him, because in the dream of the statue, Nebuchadnezzar's got a high place. He's the head of gold. And and the interpretation says, you're going to last through this. So Nebuchadnezzar's not worried. He's met the high God at this point in time. You would think that would have nudged Nebuchadnezzar towards the true God, but it doesn't. You would think in the chapter 3, when Nebuchadnezzar has thrown Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, and he has seen 3 men in the fire plus a 4th, and they come out and they testify who it is, and Nebuchadnezzar says, only your God, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, could have done this. You think that would have also nudged Nebuchadnezzar towards the Most High God, but see, that didn't affect him in any way either. It's fixing to affect him greatly because he is fixing to have an encounter with the living God. And it's going to be on him and not on someone else. Oh, he thinks he has the authority, yes, to tear people limb from limb and to reduce their houses to heaps of rubbish and to throw three Hebrew boys into a flaming fire, and no one can do anything about it. Oh, yes, he can. God's in charge, and he can do with the high that he wants. He can take the high to the low. He can bring the low and he can take him up to the high. He can do what he wants. And here, even though this is totally completed and he's telling this story over, he's telling us what happened on the way. He says, Daniel told me that I am going to be put into this situation. Verse 26. And in that it was commanded to leave the stump with its roots, Daniel says, the roots of the tree. Your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. In other words, nobody's going to come get your kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar. But for 7 periods of time, you're not going to be on the throne. You're going to be out there in the field. You're going to be out there crawling on your hands and knees. You're going to have the mind of an animal, but no one's going to take your kingdom away from you. Well, if Nebuchadnezzar went crazy and went crawling around, I wonder who's in charge of the kingdom. Daniel, the second in command. That's correct. And you're going to be there on your hands and knees until you realize that heaven rules. Your problems in this life today are going to continue until you realize that heaven rules. When you give it up and give it all to heaven, that's when things will be going better. Therefore, O king, Daniel's trying to do something here. My advice may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, you want to hang on to this just long as you can. Don't do anything wrong. Please don't do anything wrong. Help the poor, stop sinning, and perhaps the Most High God will allow this to kind of wait for a while. Just wait for a while. Look what happens in the next. The writer of this, who's picking up, and everything up to this is probably part of Nebuchadnezzar's letter. And the writer jumps in here and he says, whoever it was that recorded the whole book of Daniel, we don't know who it was. It says, all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. It happened. It just happened. And now the writer comes along and he's going to tell us what happened and how it happened. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of his royal palace of Babylon. And the king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? Is this not the house that I've built? Is this not the high rise that I have built? Is this not the court case that I have won? Is this not this? Is this not that? Is this not this that I have done for my glory and for my prestige, so that all the people will look at me and say, look, there he goes. Can you believe? Oh my, oh my. Buddy Griffin, this banjo teacher, was a guy by the name of Paul Buscar. And if you don't know who he is, he's probably the greatest single-string banjo player and guitar player and all of that in the world. And he was best friends with Willie Nelson. And up in his house in Nacogdoches, after he got to where he could not climb the stairs to his bedroom, that became the guest bedroom. At the house the other night, we met Paul Buscart's bass player, who played with him for about 15 years. And they talked about how they would go to his house in Nacogdoches and they'd get to sleep in the bed that Willie slept in. Oh, Willie Nelson slept in this same bed. Ooh, can you believe? And I'm thinking, who would want to? Maybe one of them ticks or something out of his hair, growing. Did he leave oil from his hair on the, what? Why? But I'm telling you, it's like the president coming or the Queen of England coming. Oh, it's the Queen. It's the Queen. He reflects and that same way. Look at all that I have done. And while the words are in his mouth, look what happens. While the words were in the king's mouth, a voice came from the heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the fields, and you will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you. You will recognize the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whom he wishes. Nebuchadnezzar, you were the greatest, but you have just accredited all to you. You have forgotten who God is, who the Most High is. Therefore, the dream that you saw is going to begin right now. So the first year has passed since the dream happened. We're 12 months down. Nebuchadnezzar goes out climbs the stairs to the top of his palace. He looks out where he can see everything as far as he can see for miles and miles in every direction. And he claims that he has built it on his own, for his own glory and for his own majesty. And I wish God operated in the same way today. Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, because of your sin and your iniquity, this starts now. And immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. And he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until his hair had grown like the eagle's feathers, and his nails like the bird's claws. Nails like bird's claws. A member of this class many years ago, who's now gone on to be with the Lord, was one of the most wonderful men that I'd ever met, an incredible godly Bible student. His name was Aubrey Law. And there were days where I would go visit him or pick him up, and he couldn't get his shoes on because his toenails had grown out about this long and curled over, and he couldn't get him in. I said, Aubrey, do we need to cut those toenails? I can't reach them anymore. Yeah, I can understand this. I can understand this. As I see our homeless guys come in and their skin begins to get very, very tough and brittle from the, not brittle, but very, very tough and leathery from the sun, it seems like their hair gets really, really hard also, like the parts of an eagle's feather. You see it. You see it. So off Nebuchadnezzar goes. Verse 34. But at the end of the period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven. 7 years later, Nebuchadnezzar says, I looked up and raised my eyes towards heaven. Did he drink water from the river like an animal? Or did he use his claws and paws to bring it up? Because he had the mind of an animal for 7 years. What did he do? What did he do? He raised his eyes towards heaven. He says, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. I often have one of those dreams where I have slid down a rope that has a knot in the bottom last 2 inches of the rope, and I'm about 100 feet short of having enough rope. And I'm hanging there, and the only thing that's keeping me from slipping off is that knot. Now, when you've got 100 feet below you and 100 feet above you, but the 100 feet above you's got a lifeline, which way do you climb? Up. When you dig a hole or fall into a hole, you don't start digging down to get out of it. You start looking up, don't you? Right. When you're at the bottom, at the end of the rope, there's only one place to look, and that is up. Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of his rope, in the bottom of a hole, wherever he is, as an animal crawling on the ground, finally looks up at the end of 7 years, just as declared, just as prophesied. And he looks up and his senses return to him. The mind of a man, of the king, is returned to him. And he proclaims that the Most High God is the God of all dominion over all the earth, everywhere. God is God, and there's no other God. Verse 35, and all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. But he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hands or say to him, what hast thou done? Whatever God wants to do, he can do it. He can build you up as the king of a kingdom and put everything in the known world underneath your command, and he can take you down to your hands and knees and make you crawl on the ground for 7 years. And then he can restore it all back to you. And he can do it in an instant. And he can do it. And even though we do not understand why he is doing what he is doing, he is God and he has a reason and he has a purpose. Verse 36. And at that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. And my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. He was put back on the throne. He was put back on the throne. And he's turned his heart to God, to the Most High God. And his counselors and nobles started seeking him out. Do you know how odd that is? How odd that is. We have people walking around the church here that you think are just the epitome of righteousness, and they have just been good all of their life. And so you'll start talking about them. And I don't know why it's this way, but you'll end up at the dinner table with someone and you're talking about how good this person is. And that person you're talking with says, yeah, they got their act together. Yes, they do. But 30 years ago, and they always bring it up. There's always someone there to remind you of how bad that person was 30 years ago. I want to know why these counselors and nobles decided to trust Nebuchadnezzar again. Don't they remember that for 7 years he was out there in the field crawling around with like an animal? Yeah, he's got his act together now, but he was crazy one time. I didn't know he was crazy. Every new generation is born. They come up and they look back on the history of the great people of the history and they think, oh, they're wonderful. Well, just talk to some people and lo and behold, somebody goes, yeah, but did you know back then? They do it in prayer requests too. Do you know that? Lord, I want to thank you for Mrs. Mary and how good things are going. We just praise you and honor you for Mrs. Mary and what she's been to everybody. We don't want to tell anybody what she did 20 years ago. And everybody in the prayer circle is going, what'd she do? You're not going to hear another word, are you? Nope, right there. Brain functioning ending statement. All you can think about, what'd she do? What'd she do? You know that physician, he's a good physician, but do you know what happened to him 30 years ago? You know that teacher, good teacher, yeah, wonderful teacher, but you know what she did 30 years ago? Comes up in my family all the time. I truly should not have had the honor of graduating with my graduating class. All the things I did in my senior year that I got in trouble with, just being fun, I should not have had the honor of walking across the stage. Had I did the things today that I did back then, were just good old mischief, okay? They would not even let me in a public school. Now, none of y'all think about anything I've said so far. What'd he do? What'd he do? What'd he do? What'd he do? Well, fortunately, just go back and get the tapes because I've told you everything I did, and I can't believe I did them. But we didn't know better. But let me tell you something. My teachers who are still alive in Waxahachie, they remember everything I did. Yeah, they did. One of them still calls me Jimmy, little Jimmy. We're so proud of you. You've done so good in your life. You've finally gotten over what you did 30 years ago. The counselors come to Nebuchadnezzar and they put their trust and they seek him out again, and his sovereignty is restored. And then lo and behold, we get the end of it. It says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. He's not giving honor to his sun god or his moon god or anything anymore. He's giving honor to his King of heaven. For all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. Nebuchadnezzar is saying, look, I was awfully prideful, but I needed correction. And the God of heaven came and gave me correction. And now I don't rule this kingdom like I used to rule. Now I rule this kingdom because it belongs to him and to only him. And I am just the servant here on earth that's taking care of it. But he is the God who it all controls, who controls it all. And he does with those who are, he exalts those he wants to, and he takes low those that he wants to. And guess what he says? He's the King of heaven. We will not ever hear from Nebuchadnezzar again in the book of Daniel. He's done. He's over with. This is all that we hear from him, but we got him where God wanted him to get. God wanted him with the story of the statue of the dream that he had to nudge him towards the true God. Because God has anointed, as we find out in Jeremiah, God had anointed and set Nebuchadnezzar to be the judge over the southern kingdom, to get them where God wanted them to be, and use Nebuchadnezzar. He was anointed, he was appointed, he was ordained to do that. And God also wanted that ordained servant to be with him for all eternity. So when you get to heaven, I want you to shake Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Because he'll be there. He will. Our time is up. We got 3 minutes before we're supposed to be out of this room, so let's pray. Lord Jesus, I thank you so much that you are a wonderful God who takes care of all and controls all circumstances. For those of us who love you and call you the King of our heaven, the King of our life, the Most High God, we put our trust in you as our Lord and Savior. You control the circumstances for our good if we will just humble ourselves, turn away from our pride, and allow you to control everything. Walk in your will. That's what we want to do. So with that, we ask you to guide us this week in everything we do. In your name, amen.